Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of Plugged In, where we plug you into the socket of reality. We are your hosts, Zishan and Ali, and today we have Brother Daniel Haqiqatjou as our special guest. Brother Daniel was born in Houston, Texas. He attended Harvard University, where he studied physics and philosophy. He completed a master's degree in philosophy at Tufts University. He has spoken at universities and mosques around the U.S., and his work has been featured in outlets such as the Washington Post, The Atlantic, CNN, Al Jazeera, Public Discourse, Mashable, and First Things. He currently teaches at the Respect Graduate School. Brother Daniel, who also heads his personal project site called the Muslim Skeptic, is a very outspoken and prolific critic of the modernist and postmodernist ideologies of today. Brother Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's really we're really excited to have you on the show and discuss these very important topics. And as everyone can see from the header of the topic for the show, the topic for today is liberalism versus Islam. But before we let you, Brother Daniel, share your insights on the topic at hand, we always first like to get the personal backstory from our guests about why they do what they do. And I know that, your extensive work revolves around the Islamic worldview. But what we'd like to know, for the benefit of the listeners, when and how did Islam become a staple in your life and in your intellectual activism? If you can kind of share that, how that came about.
Sure. So I grew up in a secular Persian family, and my parents moved here from Iran in the 1970s and 80s. My dad moved here first for school, then my mom. And they raised me with Persian culture and kind of Shia Muslim identity. As I entered high school, again, it was a secular background. This is very common amongst Iranians who come to the U.S. and other Western countries. I knew some of the basics about Islam. I believed in God. I believed in the Quran. But my level of knowledge was very lacking. And I considered myself a typical average American with the same kinds of aspirations and concerns and loves and hates as an average American teen. So what was shocking to me, though, is that I got into more contact with other Muslim teens, that I hadn't really had any friends growing up, Muslim friends. I wasn't really introduced to the masjid environment or the mosque. I hadn't been to Friday prayers up until that point in my life. I didn't know how to read Arabic or to read the Quran. So I was very ignorant about a lot of things. And then alhamdulillah, I was fortunate enough to find Muslim friends. And as far as they're concerned, they were just doing what they had what they believed in, what they'd been raised. They had been raised in more practicing, devoted environments. They were connected to the masjid, etc. And they just had a very positive influence on me. And I was able to start asking questions and to start doing my own research and to start learning about Islam more deeply. And so I started doing this just of my own kind of volition, and that kind of knowledge spurred me to learn more about Islam, to have that desire to change my behavior, change my life in accordance with what God wants, with what Allah wants of me, and to be personally motivated to do that. So it was a big paradigm shift that I experienced, and alhamdulillah, I'm very pleased and happy that this happened in my life, and I thank Allah for that. But then once that occurred, I started to learn more. I also came across a lot of critiques against Islam especially as I graduated high school and went into college. And there were liberal critiques of Islam, secular critiques of Islam, feminist critiques of Islam. And some of these critiques really resonated with me because even though I had become more practicing and identifying as a Muslim and devoted in my personal life, I still considered myself a liberal person. And I believed certain things about Islam, that Islam is as a religion, endorses liberalism, secularism, feminism, and so forth. But then if we accept those things, then there are some very disturbing aspects of the Quran. There are some very disturbing aspects of hadith, of the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And if you read those things and coming from a liberal, secular, feminist mindset, they will be disturbing to you. And I was disturbed personally, and I didn't know how to reconcile my commitments to Islam and the truth of the Quran, the truth of the Prophet as the messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with these larger ideologies that I consider to be also valid. So within college, I was able to do more research. I had good friends who were older than me who were able to guide me and explain. And they, at Harvard, they themselves were very brilliant minds, mashallah, and they helped me. I did my own research, and I was able to criticize or critique or see the holes in some of these larger ideologies that I had taken for granted for the entirety of my life, and my family at large had taken for granted. And so I felt very fortunate to have gone through this process of kind of detox, right? Detoxing from the influence of these ideologies. And once I went through that kind of detox, then a lot of things made sense. A lot of things started making sense. The same kind of problems and disturbances that I had experienced before, those just melted away. And they melted away not because I just was ignoring them or because I was ignoring the conflicts or I said, oh, well, Allah knows best. Of course, Allah knows best. But I also was able to rationally understand, okay, this is why certain things are the way that they are in Islamic law and Islam as a whole. And even if the modern world does not accept these tenets of belief or these practices or these ahkam, these rulings within Islamic law, that's a deficiency on the part of the modern world. That's a deficiency on the part of the modern world. And so I came to really internalize this and continue to do research for years and years. And then I thought, well, I should be able to share this kind of these arguments and this information with the rest of the Muslim community. And hopefully that'll be beneficial for the rest of the Muslim community. So that's what I've been doing over the past 5 years is I've been writing and speaking on these issues, and hopefully, it's had some impact, and I'm always looking for feedback from other Muslims. And I do get feedback from other Muslims who say, look, I also came from a secular, liberal, feminist background, and you've opened my eyes, or this information has really opened our eyes to the kinds of holes that are inherent to those ideologies. And now those doubts, the shubuhat that we had about Islam have been addressed because of this approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, would it be safe to say that so far your life had kind of two phases, right? So when your experience with with fellow Muslims in the States, you were introduced to, say, Islam and its basic tenets, and once you've kind of accepted that, you still, I guess at that time you were still appealing to liberalism, and then the second phase is where this approach, appealing to liberalism, was a wrong approach. Would we be safe to say that it's kind of like two phases you've gone through?
Yeah, I would say that that's an accurate description. The thing is that as you learn more and more about the Islamic tradition,
yep,
and you study it more deeply, like you actually read some of the texts and you get past some of the superficial approaches or some of the very high-level information about Islam, then you get to texts that don't conform to these modern ideologies. And so it's inevitable. As you learn more, you'll get to that point. And then, every student of knowledge, of Islamic knowledge, reaches this realization, and then they have to, at least in the modern world, they have to then ask themselves, okay, well, how do I deal with this conflict? And a very common approach is to say, well, this text or this ayah or this hadith, it's not relevant to the modern world. It's about a different time and place, and it's not really applicable. There are different methods that certain academic Muslims especially, and increasingly students of knowledge, unfortunately, are using to kind of dismiss and criticize and do away with those quote-unquote inconvenient texts in order to justify and champion or preserve a kind of modernist ideology or worldview or perspective that they're committed to. And those kinds of interpretations are rewarded because the powers that be within the West and within the Muslim world, due to the influence of colonialism, reward any interpretation or any methodology that champions the ideologies of the West, that champions the ideologies of modernism. And so those people who are engaged in that kind of interpretive exercise are rewarded with scholarships, with grants, with positions at the top universities, with all kinds of media access. And that's what perpetuates these wrong ideas and these wrong approaches to Islam. And that's what has caused this decline of Islamic knowledge within the past 200 years.
Mm-hmm. And I guess this is a kind of segue into, your initiative that you had started called the Muslim Skeptic, and you've already, I think you've started outlining your motivations for launching an initiative like this. This is quite interesting. Muslim Skeptic, when I first came across this, I thought, it's another person who's skeptical about topics or ideas of, God's existence, and someone who's skeptical about the Quran as revelation from God. But when I took a little closer look at your website, it's basically, as you stated in your works, that you've basically turned the tables. You're outlining arguments where you're showing your skepticism about the prevailing ideologies of today, such as liberalism and secularism. But if you can tell me a little bit more about this initiative called Muslim Skeptic, and how that all got started.
Yeah, sure. So like I mentioned, I started writing because originally my plan was to go into academia and to complete a PhD and teach and try to have a positive influence through the university. But what I quickly came to realize is that the university does not tolerate any kind of critique that I'm willing to provide that is going to undermine these ideologies that are taken for granted or are considered to be all but, God's truth, right? So there's a kind of dogmatism that's found within academia. There's a dogmatism that's found in the wider culture. And if you don't accept those tenets of belief, you're not going to make it as an academic. And, I would, write certain papers that within philosophy that would question the morality of certain kinds of practices or would question the entire idea of secular morality in the first place. And I found a lot of pushback and anger even at those critiques, even though I was writing in an objective way. I wasn't citing Quran or I wasn't writing as a Muslim. I was using the same kind of secular argumentation which should have been accepted within that context. Nonetheless, the kind of arguments that I was making were met with a kind of offense and anger from my professors and other graduate students in my department. So then I realized that this is going to be a really hard road to go down, to try to make it in academia and to have an influence. And I thought, like, this is not worth it. It's not worth the effort. And there has to be a better way to make an impact on the public discourse and the perspectives that Muslims have. So that's when I started writing, and I had to come up with a name for the website. I had to think of a name for this kind of effort, and I chose Muslim Skeptic to, like you mentioned, turn the tables on this idea of skepticism, and to imply, implicit to the name Muslim Skeptic, is that there are these gods, there are these dogmas that have been taken for granted and have just been assumed to be true, and no one is really questioning the dogma. No one is really attacking the dogma. The only object of attack from the perspective of these ideologies is religion, organized religion, especially Islam. And so, okay, well, let's give you a taste of your own medicine. Let's ask these kinds of critical questions. Let's do the kind of critique and see if these ideologies hold mustard. And so that was the motivation behind naming this project the Muslim Skeptic. And the website is muslimskeptic.com, and that's where I compile a lot of my writing that I've engaged in over the past 5 years.
You know, and it's very interesting because there's not many Muslims who have systematically, analyzing and dismantling the ideas of, secularism, feminism, and liberalism. And I guess, and many people, as well as many Muslims, are not even aware of, what these terms really mean, right? So, for the benefit of the listeners, I know you've been very critical of these ideas concerning secularism, feminism, and liberalism. Just for the benefit of the listeners, if you can just kind of briefly define these terms and why are you so critical of them?
Okay, so let me just start with that question. I'm critical of them because they are contrary to Islam, and in fact, they're anathema and they're poisonous and toxic to Islam. They're anti-Islamic, and these are ideologies that have been used to attack Muslims historically through colonialism and imperialism. And these are the ideologies that continue to be used to attack Islam and to subjugate Muslim societies. And also, these ideologies are poisonous to human existence in general. And we can see that with the trends within modernity and how society has unraveled due to the influence of these ideologies. So we can talk about all that stuff, but just to define what liberalism is, so we'll start with that. Mm-hmm. So liberalism is the idea that, so one thing to emphasize, though, is that when we use the word liberalism, it has many different meanings depending on the context that you're using it. So if you're talking about politics, you can talk about conservatives versus liberals, and that's in the context of political discourse within a single country. But that's not the liberalism that I'm referring to. I'm referring to capital L liberalism, which is philosophical liberalism. And philosophical liberalism is so broad that it encompasses conservatives and liberals in the political context. So Donald Trump would be considered a liberal, a philosophical liberal according to this definition, for example, or George Bush or whoever else within the American context or the Canadian context. So what is philosophical liberalism? So this is an ideology that came about starting from the 17th century, leading to the 16th, 17th, and 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and originated with European thinkers who claimed that the only way to understand what is right and wrong, whether on the level of a person's life, individual morality, or within political morality, is to look at what policies increase freedom and increase liberty. Whatever increases freedom and liberty is good, and whatever decreases freedom and liberty is bad. And this is how we have to understand ethics and morality and governance. And we have to abandon religious conceptions of right and wrong, because if we appeal to religion, that's irrational, that's superstitious religion, and they had Christianity in mind, as well as Islam and other religions. Religions are a hindrance to progress. Religion is a hindrance to rationality and enlightenment. So if we want to define right and wrong, we only need to reflect. We only need to use reason to determine, okay, what is it that increases freedom and liberty and equality? Whatever that is good and right and morally permissible, and whatever decreases freedom, liberty, and equality is bad. And we need to get rid of that and rid society of that so that we can achieve progress and advancement in society. So this is the moral and political philosophy that originated with these Enlightenment thinkers in Europe, mainly England and France, and Germany a little bit as well. And so this is how they defined it, and they used that kind of perspective on liberalism to attack religious societies, indigenous societies, and Muslim societies as being less advanced, not enlightened, stuck in the Dark Ages, stuck with this backwards idea of religion as being determinative of right and wrong, politics and morality. And so all of the early liberals, European liberals, were also colonialists. And they used liberalism as a program to colonize and commit all kinds of atrocities and barbaric acts of genocide against populations around the world, and in large part against Muslims. So that's liberalism, a little quick overview of the origins of that idea. Secularism is the view that it is a subtopic within liberalism, and secularism has it that within governance, you have to have a separation of church and state, in the sense that laws should not be based on religious principles or doctrines of right and wrong. And so you have many liberal thinkers who have expostulated on this idea of secularism and the virtue and the justice of a separation of church and state. And one of the main thinkers in recent times is John Rawls. John Rawls, who taught at Harvard, and he gave his conception of political liberalism and why liberalism and secularism are the most capable of creating a society of justice, a just governance. And their idea is that if you have one religion that determines what is right and wrong, and one religion that determines the law of the land, then that becomes an object of oppression, because not everyone within a given society is part of one religion. So that's not fair. How can you impose one religion on everyone? That is the very epitome of injustice. That's why we have to keep religion out of the picture and not have religion be involved with the law of the land. So this is the argument that they make, and it seems like a very convincing argument to people who study this. So that's secularism. And then feminism is the idea that oftentimes feminism is conflated with the idea of women's rights, but this is a mistake. You have to understand that feminism is just one approach to women's rights. Feminism is just one approach to women's rights, and it makes certain claims about the history of the world. Okay, and feminism originally originated with those same liberal Enlightenment thinkers who claimed that Muslim societies and Aboriginal societies, Chinese, Indian societies oppress their women and subjugate their women because they force them to dress in certain ways, because they prevent them from acting in certain ways. Therefore, as colonizers, we're justified in attacking those nations and committing genocide, and this is the civilizing mission that we have to save these women from Muslim men. And so feminism originated with these kinds of thinkers within the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And it was only at the end of the 19th century that European women and American women started to use this idea to criticize the practices within European and American society itself. And that they were the first wave feminists, what's known as the first wave of feminism. And when you look at the writing of these first wave feminists, they were very anti-religion right off the bat. They were very anti-religion. They were very anti-motherhood, anti-family within that first wave.
Yeah.
Right. And then the second and third wave only got progressively worse. But the idea is that women have been systematically oppressed and systematically subjugated by men throughout time, throughout history. And so this is a central pillar of feminism. You can't be a feminist unless you believe that this patriarchy exists, patriarchy in the sense of men conspiring with each other to subjugate women systematically. And so this is something that is very toxic to Islam for many reasons, but I'll leave that for later in the discussion. But these are the definitions that we can use for liberalism, secularism, and feminism.
Yeah, and that's okay. And we can have a show. Actually, we can have an entire show on each of these, ideologies or sub-ideologies, you could say, of liberalism. And it's interesting how you've and you also outlined this in your writings as well, that these ideologies, secularism, feminism, liberalism, were used as tools for colonialism, and people never tie that with these ideologies. So this is quite an eye opener for many people when they look into this. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Right, and it's not just limited to the past. It's definitely something that these ideologies are used in the present day as well, for precisely the same means. And unfortunately, many Muslims have been co-opted to help colonizers and to help imperialists gain greater and greater control of the Muslim world. So this is an ongoing process. It's not just a relic of the past.
Yeah, and this actually kind of segues into my next question. Is when you critique liberalism in contrast to Islam, and I've come across this in your works where you've quoted the verse from the Quran, which says, "God has not made for any man two hearts within his body." And if you could kind of elaborate on this further.
Yeah, so it goes back to what I had said earlier, that these ideologies have become dogma. They've become unquestioned tenets of belief that people accept without further reflection or justification. And if you have this kind of commitment to these ideologies, then conflict is inevitable. You will, because some Muslims might say that, there's overlap between Islamic doctrine, and liberalism, secularism, and feminism. In fact, many Muslims have argued this in the academic context and elsewhere. And the reality, however, is that conflict is inevitable. You can't accept both. There are irreconcilable differences, and that's going to manifest itself sooner or later, depending on the level of knowledge that you have about Islam. And so that's what I was referring to in citing that verse. You can't be committed to both at the same time. It's analogous. It's perfectly analogous to the Quraysh and the Mushrikeen in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, who were proposing that, okay, we will worship Allah, or we will accept Islam. This is what they said. We will accept Islam, but we just want certain days of the week where we can worship our idols. And of course, this was not accepted. And the verses of Surah Al-Kafirun were revealed to say that no, you have to enter Islam completely. If you want to keep your religion, okay, keep it, but don't mix it, okay, to you, your religion, and to us, our religion, Islam.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Or
it's the same idea.
yeah, or like basically you want to, okay, we'll accept Islam and capitalism, right? Because they, obviously they didn't want to pay zakat and they didn't envision the entire
Exactly.
economy. Yeah, exactly.
Right, exactly. Some of the munafiqun did not want to pay zakat.
Yeah.
So they rejected that, and it's the same idea. Like, you can't add and subtract from Islam as you desire, and that's an inevitability for any foreign ideology. It doesn't have to be liberalism, secularism, or feminism. If you try to reconcile communism, communism is a sub theory of liberalism, because it also advocates for maximizing liberty and equality in society. It just has a different vision of how to do that as opposed to capitalism. So it's still a liberal ideology. But there were Muslims back in the heyday of communism that wanted to reconcile Islam with communism. And they would cite verses about sadaqah, zakat, freeing slaves. And they would say that, look, in the Quran, we have this endorsement of communism, and we need to be communist Muslims.
Yeah, I remember that. And it's quite telling. But I know Ali has been waiting patiently. He had he had some questions he wanted to ask you. Ali, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. It was an interesting discussion going on here. You did, Daniel, touch upon the definitions of liberalism, secularism, and feminism. I mean, within the modern context, when the very word liberalism comes to mind, we tend to quickly jump to conclusions that the worldview offered by this political philosophy ought to be good for humanity in general. As it supposedly offers freedom of speech, religion, equality, democratic governments, so on and so forth. How true do you think these assumptions from an Islamic worldview are?
Well, this is what we need to do, is to understand these claims that liberalism makes about the best society being a liberal society, the best societies being secular societies, the best societies being the ones that are the most feminist, right? Because the people who are making these claims, that if they don't say it explicitly, then it's certainly implicit. That if these are the best societies, then that means that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was not part of the best society. That the first three generations of Islam were not the best of humanity and the best, because they didn't recognize these ideologies. There was no secularism in the time of the Prophet. Like, they didn't have a conception of that. There was no idea of maximizing liberty and equality as being the basis of right and wrong. They didn't have those conceptions. So does that mean that they weren't the best societies? As Muslims, we're committed theologically to the belief that what the Prophet ﷺ brought and implemented in his society at the completion of his mission and his message was brought about the peak of human society. Okay, and if we truly believe that, then this is what causes the conflict, because they weren't secular, they weren't liberal, and they weren't feminist. So the way to engage in a kind of argument against liberalism is to say that, okay, well, you claim that society is best insofar as it achieves these kinds of liberties, but what do you mean by liberty? What do you mean by equality? What do these terms actually refer to? And then once you start doing that kind of probing, you realize that it's just a house of cards and it all comes crashing down. And as a point of fact, it's not just Muslims who are making these kinds of critiques. Or we have the luxury of there being non-Muslims who have already leveled these kinds of criticisms against liberalism, secularism, feminism. They haven't done it in service of a particular religion, but non-Muslims in academia have already deconstructed these ideologies, and we can, as Muslims, learn from that and use that to our own benefit. And we just have to be careful that we don't fall into some kind of postmodernism or post-colonialism, because some of those ideologies are also loaded with other kinds of baggage that we don't want to necessarily mix. So it has to be a very nuanced, careful consideration of how to use certain arguments. But let me give you a sample of what I'm talking about. So if we look at the idea of freedom, okay, so what does it mean for a human being to be free? And what the Enlightenment thinkers, liberal thinkers, meant by this is that human being is free insofar as his interests, fundamental human interests, have been achieved and have been preserved. Okay, so human beings have a fundamental interest in life. Okay, people don't want to just be killed. Okay, randomly. Human beings have this interest in being a part of a family and having children. Human beings have an interest in sexual autonomy. Okay, these are the kinds of human interests that are inherent to a human being. And therefore, if we want to maximize human freedom, we have to realize these rights. Okay, we have to realize these human interests. And that's what human rights ideology is based off of. But we can question that very easily. We can say that, okay, who decides what is a fundamental human interest? Okay? Mm-hmm. Who says that humans have a fundamental interest for having as many sexual partners as possible? Who says that that is healthy? Who says that that leads to human flourishing, right? Why would you propose that? And so we can question these kinds of claims about human interests because these claims are inherently metaphysical. Like there's no scientific experiment that you can do that would prove that some X, Y, or Z is essential or part of the human essence and leads to these kinds of ends, these positive ends. And as far as Islam is concerned, we also have within the Quran, Allah tells us what does it mean to be a fulfilled human being? What are fundamental human interests? One of the most important is to know God, to worship Allah, to know your Creator, to understand where you come from, to understand where you fit into this larger universe. That is a very important, fundamental part of being a human being and being a fulfilled human being. And anything that conflicts with that or anything that detracts from that is actually taking away from human interests and could be considered a form of oppression, right? So we can use the same kind of language and we can use the same kind of argumentation to show a completely different set of practices as being consistent with maximizing human freedom, right? And it's a fun exercise to do. You can look at what are considered the most oppressive regimes in the world today, like the Taliban, for example, and you can do this kind of exercise of redefining what is or is not within human interest, and then derive all of these different human rights based off of that, and claim that if we truly want to champion human freedom and human rights, we should look to the Taliban, right? Mm-hmm. Or any other regime, North Korea, to go outside of a Muslim context. And I'm not endorsing the Taliban. I'm just saying how these kinds of arguments can be turned on their heads. And what that shows us, what that tells us, is that this idea of freedom itself is a very hollow, vacuous notion that you can fill whatever you want in it if you're clever enough. And many examples I can give you about that. But freedom of speech, okay, this is something that's very easy to critique, and it's been done by non-Muslims. In fact, the best critique is from a philosopher, professor of literature named Stanley Fish. Okay, and he's Christian, but he is well respected within academia, and he wrote this popular book, There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and it's a good thing too. And what he argues in this is that all communities have standards of speech. All communities have standards of appropriate, correct speech that they uphold, and they uphold by force. And it makes sense. And this is what I explain because I teach a class on Muslim intellectual fulfillment, and we look and systematically critique all of these ideologies, and we spend a whole unit on freedom of speech because it's relevant when you look at Sharia, when you look at Islamic law. But what Stanley Fish, based off of what Stanley Fish says, you can understand that all speech is analogous to human action, right? Mm-hmm. You can do a lot of damage. You can do a lot of harm with your speech, right? And we can see this within the law itself, because not all speech is permitted, even within secular law. As an example, libel. You can't go around libeling people. You can't go around libeling corporations. Corporations aren't allowed to make false claims and do false advertising, so their speech is restricted in that way. Individual people, parties, can't go around insulting each other. Like, there's this idea of fighting words. Okay, if I go up to someone and start berating him, insulting his mother, using racial slurs, and he punches me, according to the law, he's within his rights, because I have committed so much offense. I've harmed him. I have taken away from his rights, and he is within his rights to retaliate. So this is all part of secular law, and implicit in this is the recognition that words can cause a great deal of harm. Think about all of the restrictions on hate speech and on racial slurs, and this is a good thing, right? This is a good thing. We want a society where, even if it's not in the law itself, okay, for example, if you're familiar with the NBA basketball, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers was secretly recorded making derogatory remarks about black people.
Yeah, I remember that.
He was secretly recorded. Yeah, do you remember that? So then there was no law against the comments that he made. There was no law against the bigoted type of remarks that he made, but there was a lot of social pressure. There was outrage that we don't want this guy as an owner of a basketball team consisting of mainly black players. This is not something acceptable in decent civil society. There's a great deal of harm that is caused by this guy's words and even by this guy's beliefs. And we need to punish him. We need to sanction him as a society. Even if there are no laws that can imprison him or to in any other way deter him from those kinds of beliefs, nonetheless, we as a society need to take action, right? Mm-hmm. And implicit to that is the view that there are certain words and there are certain beliefs that are deeply harmful, that cause a great deal of harm. And insofar as we're interested in a society that does not promote racism, where racism is not something that's just in the air, oppressing us all, we need to take action to restrict certain kinds of speech, right? And so we all accept this. We all accept this. It doesn't matter if you're the most liberal of liberals. Everyone accepts that there are certain things that should not be said, and in fact, they should be sanctioned, and we need to deter certain kinds of speech. And Stanley Fish's insight is that this is inherent to being a human being. This is inherent to being a part of an organized society or organization or civilization as a whole. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very profound point. But how it relates to Islam is that, well, in Islam, we also recognize this. We recognize that you don't want a society where belief in God is undermined, where belief in God is denigrated, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is being insulted. Okay, we don't want to live in a society where this is common, because that causes a great deal of harm. That causes a great deal of real, tangible harm, and we need to deter that kind of behavior. And the way that we deter it is we have punishment, and we make it illegal. We criminalize it. Okay, so this is relevant for insulting the Prophet, peace be upon him, shatim of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or even when it comes to leaving Islam, apostasy, irtidad. So you'll have liberals in the world today who will criticize Islamic law for having these kinds of provisions, these kinds of hudud, punishments and criminalization, and they say, oh, this is a violation of free speech, and therefore it's barbaric, and therefore it's unenlightened. But in reality, this is no different than any other society. Okay, if we differ, the non-Muslim with the Muslim, it's only on the question of what is truly harmful or not. What is truly harmful or not. And we maintain that this is harmful because there's an afterlife, there's an akhirah. Even if you don't believe it, that doesn't change the reality that it exists, okay? And we'll all face Allah on the Day of Judgment. And so Islamic society and Islamic law is concerned with our entire existence in this dunya and in the akhirah. And so this is tangible harm if you're threatening people's faith, if you're promoting kufr, if you're promoting disbelief in society. And so yes, of course, Islam is not only justified, this is the only course of action is to restrict and prohibit these kinds of speech that cause all kinds of harm and damage to society. And of course, we're going to have consequences for apostasy. Okay, and there are details. Like, this is not a promotion of vigilante violence. Okay, and we can get into the topic of hudud. That's a large topic. But
probably for another show.
The point is, yeah, for another show, inshallah. But the point here is that those who are criticizing Islamic law for being barbaric because it doesn't respect freedom of speech are inconsistent, and it's very easy to undermine those kinds of arguments and champion Islamic law and to show that, yes, this is what, as it was practiced by the Prophet, peace be upon him, as it was practiced by the Khulafa Rashidun, this was the peak of justice, this was the peak of morality, this was the peak of civilization and enlightenment. Yes, it was, and we can be confident in saying that and defending that in many ways, and I've just given you a sample of that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, especially how you treated the topic, the very hot topic, I should say, of apostasy, the way you explained it. We definitely have to have another show just on that topic because, we also have a disease within the Muslim Ummah where we really don't kind of step back and, deeply ponder on these issues contextually, historically, and obviously, relevant to current times as well. So thank you for that. Kind of shifting gears here, adaptation to, so-called liberal ideologies are often blamed for the Islamic crises that took root during the 18th century Ottoman Caliphate. How true do you think this accusation is? And also, if you could please provide some historical context to this for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a long history of the introduction of liberalism into Muslim society, and we see this within the later Ottoman Empire, definitely within Egypt, definitely within the subcontinent, within India, and northern Africa as well, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia. Liberalism was introduced to all of these lands, all of these Muslim lands, in an effort to control, in an effort to control Muslims and get Muslims to adopt Western colonial law, right? Because if you want to control people, you need to have them accept a legal regime, and so that they'll start behaving in accordance with the law that you've set, right? So that's the primary way to gain control of a population. And, there's nothing wrong with that. It just depends on what the law is. Islamic law is based on the will of God and what God intends and wants for people and for society, because that's part of guidance. This idea, this kind of Christianized, westernized understanding of religion, the way that religion is constructed within modern secular paradigms is to view religion as only being applicable to personal practice, right? To personal practice, what you do as an individual in your life, what you believe, and the rituals that you undertake. So that's the entire scope of religion. But Islam does not accept that. Islam does not accept that understanding of religion. Rather, guidance from God. God is not only concerned about you individually as a person. God is also concerned about the family. God is also concerned about the family and the practices and behaviors of the family. God is also concerned with the community. God is also concerned with the neighborhood. God is also concerned with society and civilization as a whole. And so he sends guidance, Islam, to guide people in all of these different domains, right? And what we as Muslims need to understand is that this is guidance that touches on all of these aspects of life, and that's a problem if you're trying to colonize a people. If you're trying to colonize a people and control them, you have to find a way to get people to disregard those aspects of religion that deal with the society, that deal with the community, that deal with the family. You need to try to convince people that those areas of life should not be dictated by God. Those areas of human existence must be dictated by the state. And so you introduce this liberal idea of secularism and a separation of church and state. And you say, no, we as colonizers determine how communities are organized. We as a state determine how families are structured. We as the state decide how an entire society will be structured and organized and how people will behave in terms of economics, in terms of politics, in terms of violence, and so on and so forth, and education and socialization. Okay, and so what is this all about? This is all about control. This is all about controlling the population. And so that's why liberalism was introduced. And the way that they did it was by saying that, look, we have implemented secularism within the enlightened European context, and look how much we've been able to achieve technologically. If you want to catch up, Muslims, you need to adopt our ways. You need to reject the backwards influence of God in these other domains. You need to embrace secularism. You need to de-Muslimize yourselves. You need to, practice religion in the privacy of your own home. Practice your religion, behind closed doors. But as far as the public domain is concerned, that God does not have anything to do with that. And so this is how liberalism was introduced, and Muslims fell for it by and large. Many Muslims fell for this trick, and they self-secularized, and they accepted the colonizer with open arms, and they continue to do so. They continue to do so all around the world to this day.
Yeah.
And don't realize that they're being bamboozled.
Yeah, and also, if you don't mind, I just wanted to share something in regards to this. As we know, the British were the major players in bringing down the caliphate, and in 1894, the British Prime Minister, late British Prime Minister William Gladstone, and then this is when the Ottoman Caliphate was on its last legs. In the British House of Commons, he said, and I'm quoting him, he said, "The situation in the East will not be successful until we remove the hijab from the woman and use it to cover the Quran." Now, this is quite telling. He knew very well that one of the ways to bring down the Muslim, or actually any human being, was to eliminate the rule of modesty in both attitude and attire in the public sphere in order to have liberalism manifested. Actually, there's a whole doctrine named after this British Prime Minister called Gladstonian liberalism. And I think this is something that Muslims should be aware of. And the ironic thing is, and as Brother Daniel, you've stated this in your works, is that many Muslims, instead of appealing to the wisdom and rationality of Islam, they appeal to the dogma of liberalism. And, and Brother Daniel, you can, comment on that further if you like. So.
Yeah, I don't think comment is necessary. I think you laid it out beautifully, and that's a fantastic and very telling quote about how these colonialists implemented their program of dominating the Muslim world and committing all kinds of atrocities and genocide on Muslims. And the more that we're aware of the writings of the colonialists in that time, the more we'll be able to draw parallels between the same kind of rhetoric and the same kind of actions that are being used today to do the same kind of thing, just by more subtle means. Because in the past, it was the discussion was, or the language that colonialists used was very explicit, that we need to civilize these barbarians.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we need to bring them into the light of modernity. Now, it's the same idea, but they talk about it using more diplomatic language, like we need to develop the Muslim world, the developing world needs aid, and we need to implement these kinds of educational programs. So this is the same idea. They're trying to re-educate and re-socialize Muslims according to a liberal conception of human society. So the same things are happening, and it's just as violent, but it's just not known in the same kind of terms. So we have to understand that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, it's also down on your blog as well, the reading list, which I follow actually quite religiously because of another author, Wael B. Halak. He also wrote The Impossible State, and he has also done some scholarly work on the Sharia as well, and which you kind of alluded upon as well. I mean, he has done a great research, how the colonialism kind of spread throughout the Muslim lands and how they just dismantled the society from within, from bottom-up approach. And that's a great work to refer to as well. I mean, in light of all these discussions we're having, I mean, what practical steps should our Ummah take to tackle liberalism or any other ism's onslaught on our Iman?
Yeah, so it depends on what you mean by practical steps. I think it really depends on your age and where you are in life. Excuse me. Because if you are in college or even high school, okay, you're in the process of becoming an adult, you are learning more about Islam. We need to practically be aware of this history. We need to practically be educated on these ideologies and how they're so toxic to Islam. And there's increasingly material out there. I'm trying to do my part by writing and speaking. I'm trying to teach a class that will be directed, inshallah, to high school age Muslim kids on what to expect when they go into college and what are the intellectual challenges that they'll face when they go to college and how to be prepared for that and how to address that. And I think that's a very practical thing. Hopefully, that class will be offered later this year. But I think I included a reading list on my website, and that's also useful because you can see non-Muslims also critiquing these ideologies. So if you're a college student, you need to, I think part of a college education, like a good college education, is being able to critique these ideologies and to see that they have all these holes and that they can be undermined. And Muslims should be reading these kinds of works and apprising themselves of these arguments and these ideas. So practically that's what should be done. If you're older and you're, for example, married, then you and your spouse practically should be thinking about how Islam calls to the importance of parenthood, calls to the importance of family, calls to the importance of maintaining ties of kinship, silata rahim, calls to all of these values that have been underemphasized due to the influence of modernity and secularism and liberalism, because these ideologies, especially feminism, attack the family and undermine the family, undermine the importance of the home. Okay, when we look at Islam, how much encouragement is there in the Quran and in Hadith and the Sunnah for maintaining ties of kinship, maintaining strong families? And when we look at even our own families, if your background is from one of these Muslim countries, look at how large the families traditionally are, and how families are connected, and how families maintain a very close connection. And this is just a part of life, and this is what constitutes the community within Islam, and that's taken for granted as being the bedrock and the framework of society. And unfortunately, that vision and that structure has been systematically destroyed and undermined in the West and increasingly in the Muslim world. We have even the nuclear family is being attacked, and so much of that kind of maintaining ties of kinship have been destroyed, where you just have nuclear families, parents barely get to see their kids because everyone is institutionalized, in the sense that, look, when you're born in an institution, in a hospital. Then if your parents are working, you go to daycare, that's an institution. Then you're in, the mandatory schooling, grade school, that's an institution. Then you go to college, that's an institution. Then you go into work for a corporation, that's also an institution. Then you retire, and then you're in a nursing home, assisted living. People's entire lives are moderated and mediated by corporate and state institutions. And this has a very big impact on the experience of life, all right? And this is very contrary to the Islamic model of life, and even not even Muslim, even prior to the rise of the corporate nation state, all societies, the family was the bedrock. The family was the cornerstone of the human experience. But now people are being separated, families are being separated from each other because of these institutions. And so Muslims need to be aware of this and think creatively about how can we counteract it and make sure that our families aren't institutionalized and broken up. And why I mention all of this is to get to the point that practically what can be done, and this is why I advocate, is that, well, if it's within your means, try to have more children. If it's within your capability, and not everyone has the biological capability or the financial situation is not conducive to having many kids. But if you can have more children, then really look for that. Try to develop this larger family system and network. Try to maintain ties of kinship in a very real way. Try to locate yourself geographically with your extended family. Try to implement that, and so that we can recreate that kind of structure that so much of Islam is predicated on. And I mean, this is a very big topic, but I think that's a very practical step that can be taken by young Muslim couples. And if enough Muslim couples do this, and enough families are created, and we revive these structures and these ideas, I think that's very practical and can have a big impact within 1, 2, 3 generations on the entirety of society. We just have to do it correctly, and we have to do it intelligently. And of course, we have to at all times have knowledge of our religion and pursue, the basics of knowledge and understanding, so that when we have kids, there's another practical step. Like if you want to have an effect on the world, then you need to make sure that your children are raised with knowledge of the deen, knowledge of the tenets of belief, so that they can understand and they can practice. And then cumulatively, if we all do this, it will lead to a very significant practical impact on the world around us. And it's just step by step, right? And just like there are shaitan, like the footsteps of shaitan, you can also go the other way. You can take step by step on Sirat al-Mustaqim. And we can get to a position where we are changing the world through the small actions that we all can make and we all have control over. And we shouldn't be overwhelmed by the fact that, the entire world is going one way, and what can we do to change it? No, we can change it. We can have a positive impact, and it starts with each and every single one of us.
Yep, and that's well put. And the telling thing is that this whole setup right now, where this whole setup, this capitalist setup, where it's breaking down the family, it's breaking the family, it's breaking the structured and tribal families we used to have. It's actually a fairly new setup, right? Because before the industrial age, people lived as you just stated. And people think that the setup now is as if it's a natural affair of life, right? It's been going on, for a very long time. And when I have these discussions and conversations with actually non-Muslims as well, they're like, they are surprised, and this setup is a whole totally unnatural setup for all of humanity. And I think we as Muslims should rise up and kind of be leading this. That Islam provides a way out of this very unnatural and, as you said, toxic setup that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we explain things to people and we historicize the current situation that we're in and make people understand that it's very new. It's very new and it's very unusual. And in fact, most of history, this wasn't the case. And furthermore, we can see the strengths and how prior structures were so much more beneficial and conducive to human flourishing. And so these are the kinds of arguments that we can make, and there's a lot of literature that can support us in making these kinds of arguments. But this also shows the importance and the wisdom, the hikmah, and the superiority of Islamic law. Because within Islamic law, all of these things are assumed, and it's implicit to the system. And the Sharia itself is meant to bring about this kind of society. Okay, you cannot implement, or you can't, as a Muslim, individually be committed to the Sharia and not maintain ties of kinship. You cannot be committed to the Sharia and not help your neighbors and feed your neighbors and help the orphan and help them, those who are destitute or those who are wayfarers or travelers. All of these values are so central to Islamic law. If you truly wanted to implement them, they allow for the emergence of the kind of society that we see in the past and that we've lost because of this corrosive influence of capitalist, liberalist, secularist ideologies, feminist ideologies.
Yeah, exactly, and all these ideologies.
That becomes a selling point for Islam.
Yeah, exactly, and all these ideologies take out the equation of God, right? And that's where all the inconsistencies come about, and basically destruction of human society. But anyways, Ali, I think you had one last question, or?
So I think pretty much covered everything. Obviously, this calls for a few more episodes. We definitely need to get Daniel back on our show.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But I think yeah.
Well.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, it was a great joy having this discussion, and Brother Daniel, I really thank you very much for sharing your findings and insights, and please keep up the great work, and thank you everyone for tuning. Sorry, Brother Daniel, what do you say?
Oh, I was saying, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. Like, if people are interested in reading more about this kind of material, you can follow me on social media and just search for my last name, or you can go to my website, Muslim Skeptic with a K, muslimskeptic.com, and a lot of my writing and videos are there. So jazakallah khair for having me on the show, and hopefully we can do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for everyone for tuning in, and till next time, be plugged in.